church family. Oh, that's weak. Let's try it again. Good morning, church family. That was better. I am so glad to see all of your pretty faces today and be back in person. For those of you online, we are thankful that you are joining us, and what an amazing time we live in where we can worship both in person, online, and around the world together. So that is awesome. Like I said, I'm glad to be back in person today. I want to thank you for the opportunity. I want to preface by saying that today's message is really just kind of me fleshing out my faith before you, and for at least for the next little bit, I'd like to share some thoughts, and I want to just be very clear that this has far more to do with me than it does you. If this resonates with you, I am glad, but I don't want you to feel like that this is me up here saying this is how you ought to be, but rather this is me just kind of sharing my personal struggles and how I want to live, and I hope that it blesses you and that you find that the Lord speaks to you through that. A few months ago, back in the beginning of December, we began to make plans not only in youth ministry but as a church with kind of what 2021 was going to look like. And I think if I'm honest with you, and I'm sure many of you found yourself in the same situation where we spent a lot of time talking about how thankful we were that 2020 was finally coming to an end. And for most of us, we were pretty excited to step into 2021. And we're sitting around in several meetings, and we're talking about this, and we're talking about, everything that's going to, what's going to happen in 2021, and how 2021 is going to be this amazing year, and that all this is going to finally be over and behind us. And I'm sitting in the meeting, and I'm talking, and I thought, I don't know that there's really any guarantee that that's going to be the case, right? It's quite possible that we get into 2021 and go, I sure would like to have 2020 back. But there was this sense that moving into the next year that perhaps we would get a fresh start or a new beginning, and things would change. And so in preparation for that, we decided that as a church and as individual ministries, we would begin to work towards a unified path forward, and in the things that we teach and the things that we say and in the direction that we're headed. And out of that came some discussion about what a disciple looks like and what foundational teachings are. And so we went into 2021 really kind of kicking off everything, talking about relationships and what it meant to have godly relationships. And we've done that from our Sunday morning platforms as well as our Wednesday night and other discipleship opportunities. And a lot of time was spent kind of talking about relationships. And as I really began to spend time praying and prepping for that, I began to think about just how difficult relationships are. In fact, over the last few months, if I'm honest with you, what I'd like to do is stand up here today and just say, hey, this following Jesus thing is hard. It is difficult. It is exhausting. It is painful. It is costly, and I'm tired. And then drop the mic and walk off. The topic we're going to talk about today is a foundational topic and a foundational truth that Jesus gives us in one of his teachings. And it sounds so simple, but it is the single most difficult aspect of being a follower and a disciple of Christ, not only to exercise, but to follow and do with any measure of discipline. In Matthew 22, we find that Jesus is being questioned by the religious leaders of the day. And they're asking him theological questions, trying to trip him up, to kind of hear what his thoughts are. And this dialogue has been going back and forth, and in Matthew 22:36, he's asked this question, "Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law?" And Jesus, as only he could do, gives this very simple yet extremely complex and offensive response. Jesus replies, "Love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, and with all of your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment, and the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and prophets hang on these two commandments." Sounds really simple. Love God with all your heart, mind, and soul. Love others as much as you love yourself. An incredibly complex yet simplistic response to a very, very tough theological question. If we take a look at all of the commandments and all of the laws, what is the greatest? Jesus gives this response. If I'm honest, the reason that these responses are so difficult is because it requires us to take an honest look inside of ourselves. The first part of the response is to love God with all your heart, mind, and soul. Very simple response. The very first commandment, thou shalt have no other God before me. The leaders of the day, those listening, the disciples around, all of them would have understood the summary that he had just given. But if we're honest ourselves, most of us don't take time to think about the complexity of that response. See, the truth is that Jesus is saying that we are to love God with all of our heart, all of our mind, and all of our soul. The hard part about that is that means that you and I have to step down from the throne of our own lives, remove the crown that we have so arrogantly placed on our heads, and submit to the one that created us. And if I'm honest with myself, I like that throne. I spend a lot of time on that throne. It's got nice wear marks in it. It fits my bottom very well. I have smoothed it, shaped it. It is a very, very comfortable throne that I sit on. I feel quite self-righteous on that throne. I feel quite in control on that throne. It gives me the proper seat to judge all that's around me. The crown fits nicely on my head. I have shaped it so that it fits perfectly. It is in my very being to sit on this throne. In fact, the reason I sit on that throne is because each and every day I am given the same choice that Adam and Eve were given, and that is to eat from the tree of life or the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And if we think about the original sin, if we think about the temptation of original sin, Adam and Eve were simply teased and tricked with this very simple thought. If you will eat from this fruit, you too will be able to determine what is good and evil. You will be equal to God, and you will be able to judge the kingdom in which you live in. And so I choose to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil rather than eating from the tree of life, which commands that I submit to the authority of the one that created me, that I walk in humility, that I allow his ways to be above my ways, his thoughts to be above my thoughts. So Jesus sums it up by going, it's very simple. First and foremost, if you want to know what the greatest commandment is, get off your throne. Love God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. Submit to his authority. Allow him to be the Lord and the ruler of your life. And the second is to love others as much as you love yourself. The problem is that I really, really love myself. In fact, most of my thoughts, most of my actions, most of my desires are centered around me. I do what I want to do when I want to do it. I live in a culture that is perpetuating this idea of consumption, that more is better. Even this morning as I was praying, I found myself several times, this commercial kept coming on over and over, and it's the new Chevy commercial. And in the commercial, they're featuring, one of the new features of their new truck is this tailgate that lowers down, and you can like form it in like 7 different ways. It does everything but cook for you, okay? So I mean, this thing is like supposed to be amazing, and in there are all these people carrying like these old tailgates, like they're going to just throw them away or whatever. And I found myself going, man, I sure would like a new truck. I mean, I've only got, a couple of vehicles. I didn't really give a whole lot of thought to how cold it was outside for those who woke up without a roof over their head, or for those who are going to catch a bus today because they don't even have transportation. 8% of the world's population owns vehicles. 8%. If you own a vehicle, you're in the top 8% of the wealthiest of the world. I would be willing to bet the vast majority of you in here have a 2-car household. So Jesus sums this up by going, look, real simple. Love God, get off the throne. You're not in charge, you're not the ruler. And then love others as much as you love yourself. He didn't even ask us to love them more than ourselves. He just says love them as much as we love ourselves. And herein lies one of the fundamental problems of our faith, and the difficulty that it is to be a follower and a disciple. Now, I open with this because the Gospels are really the foundational teachings of our faith. This is Jesus teaching us what it means to be a follower of Jesus. Acts begins to give us a blueprint of the emerging church and how church is done. And then the subsequent letters are written by the spiritual fathers of the church to encourage us on how to walk out this way that Jesus has laid out before us. Now, it would be real easy for me to just stop there. I mean, the reality is that if we're honest with ourselves, the vast majority of us find ourselves in those same situations. The vast majority of us find ourselves sitting on the thrones of our own lives. We find it difficult to love others as much as we love ourselves. Why wouldn't we? We live in a culture that perpetuates and celebrates that worldview. But you and I have been set apart, and we have a responsibility and a calling and a commission as a disciple to live differently. In 1 Corinthians 13, Paul is writing to encourage the church. And it's interesting that the church finds itself in very much the same situation that we find ourselves in. And he writes these words, and he's encouraging them on how they should live and how they should operate. And he opens in chapter 13 with these words. If I speak with human eloquence or in angelic ecstasy, but do not love, I am nothing but the creaking of a rusty gate. If I speak God's word with power, revealing all of his mysteries, making everything plain as day, and if I have faith that says to a mountain, jump, and it jumps, but I do not love, I am nothing. If I give everything I own to the poor, and even go to the stake to be burned as a martyr, but I do not love, I've gotten nowhere. So no matter what I say or what I believe or what I do, I am bankrupt without love. See, love never gives up. Love cares for others more than itself. Love doesn't want what it doesn't have. It doesn't strut. It doesn't have a swollen head. It doesn't force itself on others. It isn't always me first. It doesn't fly off the handle. It doesn't keep score of the sins of others. It doesn't revel when others grovel. It takes pleasure in the flowering of truth. Puts up with anything. Trusts God always. It always looks for the best. It never looks back, but it keeps going to the end. Because love never dies. Inspired speech, it will be over someday. Praying in tongues, it will end. Understanding will reach its limit. We only know a portion of the truth. And what we say about God is always incomplete. But when the complete arrives, our incompletes will be canceled. But when the complete arrives, our incomplete will be canceled. So Paul writes this letter to a church that's facing many, many issues. I'm just going to kind of walk through a few of the issues. Maybe some of them will resonate with you, maybe they won't. First and foremost, the church found itself set in a culture with political and social unrest, where the political leaders of the day were simply insufficient at solving the world's problems. That the culture had put its hope and trust in the leadership of man, only to find it's disappointing. The church found itself wrestling in a culture that was arguing about what morality was. That culture wants to dictate what's moral versus the church. That there are people who walk around accusing others, and those that are being accused find themselves hiding or shrinking back. That there are those that are strong and committed in their faith, but there are those that, because of the cultural pressure, are finding themselves weak and unable to stand firm in the foundation of truth. The church found itself wrestling with this reality that there are people who are rich and there are people who are poor. And the rich seem to get richer and the poor seem to get poorer. The church was wrestling with the argument of the power and the sovereignty of God and eternity, and the truth of which religion is right. I am so thankful we've come so far that we don't wrestle with that today. The reality is when Paul writes this letter, he's not only writing it to a church a couple thousand years ago, but he's writing it to you and I today who find ourselves in the same predicament. We find ourselves as the church in the middle of this battle between the world and the kingdom of heaven. And Paul goes, look, I get it. Like, I understand that there are people who can walk around, and there are politicians and leaders who can walk around and they have the most eloquent speech, and they're able to talk, and they're able to say things that sound good, and they have answers for how to save the world. There are church leaders who walk around and they speak with such godly language, and they speak of evangelical things, and they speak of prosperity. But if they're not exercising love, then it might as well be the sound of a squeaking gate. I get it, there are plenty of people who can walk around and can unpack the mysteries of the Old and New Testament. In fact, they can present things so plainly. They have incredible faith. They've seen miracles. But if they don't love, it's for nothing. I get it. You can be busy out here feeding the homeless, serving people, doing all these things. You can go home and check off the good deeds that you've done. But if you did it in the absence of love, then you wasted your effort. Because all of these things are going to fade. This inspired speech is going to be gone. We're going to reach the limit of our understanding. Because we're incomplete. We are limited. We are not God. We are not the gods of our universe. We do not have an earthly crown. We are broken individuals who are incomplete. And through the work of Christ in our lives, when the complete comes, we are made complete. And the foundation of that completeness is rooted in love. Now, here's the problem with the word love. You and I live in a time in which love is defined. I looked it up. Webster simply defines the word love as an intense feeling or deep affection. The problem is that love is not a feeling, not according to Paul. And not according to Jesus. That love is an action, it's a verb, it's a response. It takes effort, it's something that you do, it's something that you have to practice, it's something that you have to demonstrate over and over and over. The problem with our feelings is that they're fickle. I can wake up and be driving to work and feel happy and joyful. And then somebody cuts me off, and by the time I get to the stoplight, I've committed murder in my heart. There are days that I wake up and it's a joy, and I'm excited, and I feel great about being a husband or a father. And there are days that I'm going, I don't want to do this anymore. It's hard. I'm living with people who are selfish and self-centered, and they're messing up my plans for myself. Love is not a feeling, it's an action, it's a response. It's something that we do. It's not subjective, but it's objective. We can measure it. We can look at it. We can determine how well we're doing it. But it starts with understanding that you and I are incomplete. Paul says, but when the complete comes, your incomplete will be canceled. Completeness starts with understanding that God is love and that we're not God. And that if we want to truly learn to love, we want to truly become complete, that we look at the only one who is complete. And we start from that reference point. And we understand that we achieve this love by first becoming complete, and we allow that completeness to perfect us. That we become perfect when the love of Christ completes us. But for most of us, our completeness is simply summarized in the action of Christ on the cross. And that we forget that there's three things that complete us. Christ on the cross paid the penalty for your sin. It was Christ's life prior to the cross that gave you your righteousness. It is His life, His death, and His resurrection that make us perfect. On the cross, Christ took my death and gave me His life. But before He got on the cross, He lived righteously, and He gives me His righteousness and takes my unrighteousness. And what allows me to love is that love, that transfer of righteousness and unrighteousness and life and death that happens because Christ completes me and is rooted in the truth of who He is. But yet again, we define truth as a state of being true. I was listening to a couple today describe their love for one another and how they came together and all the things that they liked and loved about each other. And they're like, yeah, we had this in common, and we did this, and we had this experience, and they're going through all this other stuff. And it's like, but at the end of the day, it just boiled down to the fact that we were willing to accept one another's truth. And I thought, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. Like, it sounds pretty, but there's only the truth. There's not my truth and your truth. There is simply truth. 2 + 2 = 4. That simple equation is what allows all other mathematics to work. If you deviate from that, then everything else fails. And you and I exist in a culture that is trying to convince us that there are many truths and that love is a feeling. And Paul says that's not how it works. You're incomplete, and when the complete comes, then you are made perfect, and you are rooted in the truth, the way, the truth, and the life. Through the work of Christ in our lives, we are made complete. And our incompleteness is canceled. How does this happen? Romans 5 says, but God demonstrated his own love for us in this, that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. That while you and I were incomplete, while you and I were incapable of true love, while we were incapable of loving God with all of our heart, mind, and soul, and love others as much as we love ourselves, while we found ourselves in that incomplete state, Christ comes and lives this righteous life. And dies for us. And this is how we know that Jesus know what love is, that Jesus Christ laid down his life for us. That Jesus demonstrated that love is an action, it's a verb, it's a willingness to step into the mess. And it's a willingness to step into the difficult situation. It's a willingness to engage in life and culture and love through action, through intention. I want to close with some final thoughts. Last week, I had an opportunity to, for those of you who don't know, I still work part-time in law enforcement, and I had an opportunity to go and work at the sheriff's department in the county that I work in, and at a shot clinic. And so we were going to be handing out about 2,000 vaccines that day. And so we've got this big, massive parking lot set up, and it's as chaotic as you can imagine. People are arriving hours early, and they're having to be lined up in rows so that they don't create traffic jams. And then once they start checking them in, it's like a multi-step process they go through, and they have to fill out all these forms. And then once that's done, then that entire row, once that's complete, that entire row moves into the next phase, and they're funneled into two lines to a check-in station where people go through all their medical records and make sure everything, and then from there, they're dispersed into 4 additional lines where they pull up and they roll down the window and they go through a series of questions and they're given a shot, and then they pull forward. And the position I was in was I directed them to one of 2 parking lots depending on whether they've got an allergy history or not, so they can be monitored. And so these people are asked to go and sit in a parking lot for 15 minutes and just wait in case they have a reaction. But if they have allergies, then they go to this parking lot so we can keep a closer eye on them. And sure enough, it's 6 a.m. I mean, people are already starting to line up, and it's just busy for 8 solid hours. You're standing on your feet and you're moving people around. There's a ton of moving parts. And it's been a year since I stopped watching the news, but I do occasionally walk by a TV screen and I see this hatred between the police and African Americans. I see cities on fire. I see reports of racial tension and all this cultural tension. But for 8 hours, I watched car after car go by, and me tell people have a nice day, or they say have a nice day, or me hear them say, hey, thanks for your service. Or for 8 hours, thousands of people were gathered together, and no buildings were burned, no riots happened. It's just a bunch of human beings taking care of one another. We live in this world that is lying to us. And as the band comes out, I just want to challenge you with a couple of thoughts. 1 John says, this is how God showed his love for us, that he sent his one and only Son in the world, that we might live through him. This is love, not that we love God, but that God loves us and sent his Son as an atoning sacrifice for our sins. And that if anyone acknowledges that Jesus is the Son of God, God lives in them and they in God. And so we know and rely on the love God has for us. I am so thankful for this encouraging series that we just came out of, where Pastor Lowell challenged us to be mindful of the power of our words. And I'm so excited about this upcoming series where we're going to be challenged to take our faith and exercise the power that God has given us. But none of that matters if you and I, as the people of God, do not allow Christ to complete a great work in us, so that out of the overflow of the work of Christ in us, that love begins to flow out of us as an action, not as a feeling that's fleeing with the wind, but of a love that's rooted in the truth of the gospel and who Christ is and his teachings. And that you and I will be the men and women of God and the people of Christ, completed and righteous, that's bringing life and hope into a world that is on sinking, shifting sand, that is not on a foundation of truth, that is loving out of feeling. Church, we need to stand firm on the truth of who Christ is and the truth of what this Bible has to say, and that we let it complete us, and we let it permeate our lives, and that we love God with all of our heart, mind, and soul, and we love others as much as we love ourselves. Be blessed.